Some places announce themselves with giant signs and busy parking lots. Others almost disappear before you realize you've passed them. That was this place. Dusty and I were driving through rural Polk County when, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of a few weathered headstones tucked beneath the trees. I hit the brakes, found a place to turn around, and we came back. At first, I thought it would be another small family cemetery. We'd photograph it, pay our respects, and continue exploring. Instead, it became one of the few places we've ever gone back to a second time. 2 weeks later, we returned. Dusty wanted better photographs. I wanted to document every remaining grave before more history disappeared. Standing among those old stones, I realized this little cemetery held a much bigger story than either of us expected. A story of frontier Florida. A story of two pioneer families. A story stitched together from faded records, family memories, and questions that may never be completely answered. Today, we're going to see just how much of that forgotten story we can uncover. Before we can understand the cemetery, we have to understand the world that created it. Today, Polk County is known for citrus groves, cattle ranches, and small towns connected by highways. But in the middle of the 19th century, none of that existed. This was frontier Florida. Miles of pine flatwoods, oak hammocks, marshes, creeks, open range. The Second Seminole War had only recently ended, and much of Central Florida remained sparsely settled. Families willing to build a life here faced isolation, disease, unpredictable weather, and an unforgiving wilderness. Yet people kept coming. One reason was the Armed Occupation Act of 1842. The federal government offered land to settlers willing to move into Florida, build a home, cultivate the land, and help establish permanent communities across the territory. It wasn't an easy opportunity. It was a gamble. The people who accepted that challenge became some of Florida's earliest pioneer families. Among them were the Durrances. Family histories trace the Durrance family to this part of Florida in the early 1850s after moving south from Georgia. Like many pioneer families, they weren't simply looking for land. They were looking for a future, building homes, clearing fields, raising livestock, helping create communities where almost nothing yet existed. One member of the family would become especially important to Polk County's history. William Hutto Durrance. Born in Georgia in 1815, he grew into one of the area's respected community leaders. Then came February 8, 1861. That's the day Polk County officially became a county. 5 days later, according to Polk County historical records, William Hutto Durrance became its first elected sheriff. Imagine what that job looked like. There were no modern patrol cars, no radios, no paved roads, just miles of wilderness, scattered settlements, and a brand new county trying to find its footing. William wasn't simply enforcing the law. He was helping build the very foundations of local government. That alone would make him an important figure in Polk County history. But his connection to this little cemetery runs even deeper. One of the fascinating things about researching pioneer cemeteries is that official records often tell only part of the story. Sometimes, family genealogy fills in the missing pieces. As I started digging through genealogical records, I kept finding references to something called the Old Durrance Cemetery, located about a mile east of Homeland. That immediately caught my attention. According to those family records, Joseph Durrance, the family patriarch, was buried there after his death on March 29, 1862. Another member of the family, Winifred Durrance, is also believed to have been buried there that same year. If those accounts are accurate, then this quiet patch of ground may have begun as a private family cemetery more than 160 years ago, long before anyone called it the Crum-Durrance Cemetery, long before maps showed nearby roads, long before homeland became the community we know today. Of course, that's one of the challenges with places like this. Many early Florida cemeteries were never formally surveyed. There were no entrance signs, no official plats, sometimes not even permanent grave markers. Instead, pieces of their history survived through family Bibles, handwritten notes, local memories, and genealogical records passed from one generation to the next. Each source offers another piece of the puzzle. No single record tells the entire story. At first, I assumed this was simply a forgotten Durrance family cemetery. Then another surname kept appearing, Crumb. The more I researched, the more interesting this place became, because suddenly I wasn't looking at one pioneer family, I was looking at two. Like the Durrances, the Crums were among Florida's early settlers. Their roots likely stretched back to German ancestry, with some genealogists believing the surname evolved from Crumb. By the time they reached Central Florida, they had already embraced the hardships that came with frontier life. Family stories paint a remarkable picture. One tradition claims Harmon Crumb's family lived so close to nearby Seminole communities that their children learned to speak a Seminole dialect. Whether every detail has survived perfectly through the generations is impossible to know. But stories like these remind us something important. Frontier Florida wasn't simply settlers living apart from native people. It was a place where cultures sometimes lived remarkably close together, shaping each other's daily lives in ways that history books don't always capture. The Crums weren't just passing through either. Records from the Armed Occupation Act include an applicant named Herman Crumb, who historians generally believe was Harmon Crumb. If that's correct, it places the family among the very pioneers encouraged to settle Florida's interior. People who accepted enormous risks in exchange for the opportunity to build a life here. And just like the Durrances, their story eventually became tied to a cemetery. During my research, I came across something else that stopped me. An old newspaper article described another Crumb family cemetery near Summerfield. The article mentioned numerous unmarked graves, headstones whose inscriptions had been worn away by time and weather. Reading that description felt strangely familiar, because that's exactly what Dusty and I had been standing in just weeks earlier. A quiet cemetery where history had faded faster than the people buried there deserved. But then came the detail that really caught my attention. The article explained that Harmon Crumb eventually moved south to homeland. The very same community where the Durrance family had already established themselves. Suddenly, two separate family histories were unfolding in the same tiny frontier settlement, and I had a feeling their stories were about to come together. When we come back, we'll discover the single event that appears to unite these two pioneer families and may explain how this forgotten cemetery became known as the Crum-Durrance Cemetery. But before we continue, if you enjoy uncovering hidden history, forgotten cemeteries, and the stories that rarely make it into the history books, I'd love to have you along for the journey. Consider subscribing and ring the bell so you don't miss the next forgotten place waiting to tell its story. As I kept tracing family records, I finally came across the moment that seemed to bring all of these pieces together. October 9th, 1875. James Matthew Crumb married Nancy Elizabeth Durrance. At first glance, it might seem like just another marriage record, but in small frontier communities like Homeland, marriages often shape the future of the entire family. This wasn't simply two people beginning a life together. It was two pioneer legacies becoming one. Suddenly, the names I'd been researching separately began appearing together. The Crums, the Durrances, their stories, their descendants, and perhaps even their burial grounds became intertwined. It's likely around this time that what may have once been known simply as the Durrance Cemetery gradually became the shared family cemetery we know today as the Crum-Durrance Cemetery. Interestingly, that modern name doesn't appear on the oldest records. It seems to have evolved naturally over time, reflecting the generations of both families who came to rest here. Sometimes history doesn't change with a formal proclamation. Sometimes it changes quietly, one family at a time. One burial in particular speaks volumes about the importance of this little cemetery. William Hutto Durrance, the first elected sheriff of Polk County. After helping shape one of Florida's newest counties, William died in 1879. Genealogical records place his burial here. Think about that for a moment. The man who helped establish law and order across a brand new county wasn't laid to rest beneath an elaborate monument in the county seat. Instead, he rests here, in a quiet family cemetery tucked beneath the trees. Far from traffic, far from crowds, exactly where the people who knew him best chose to remember him. That feels strangely fitting. History often celebrates the famous. Places like this remind us that history was actually built by families. By the time I'd finished researching, I understood why this place had stayed on my mind, and why Dusty and I came back. We almost never revisit a location only a couple of weeks after discovering it. There are simply too many places waiting to be explored. But this cemetery felt different. Dusty wanted to photograph it more carefully. I wanted to record every remaining grave. Not because we expected to solve every mystery, but because every surviving headstone represents a name that still has a chance to be remembered. If these stones continue to weather, if another hurricane comes through, if another generation passes without anyone documenting them, some of these names could disappear forever. That's what preservation really is. Sometimes it's restoring a historic building. Sometimes it's saving old photographs. And sometimes it's simply making sure someone knows where a forgotten grave still stands. Walking through the cemetery today is a surprisingly emotional experience. There isn't an ornate entrance, no visitor center, no interpretive displays explaining who rests here. Just weathered stones standing quietly beneath Florida's oaks and pines. Nature has slowly reclaimed much of the cemetery. Some markers lean, others have broken. Some inscriptions have become almost impossible to read. And then there are the empty spaces, the places where you can almost feel that someone should be there. A shallow depression in the ground, a lone field stone, an area where the spacing suggests another burial once existed. Those are the moments that stay with you. Every visible marker tells us someone's name survived, but just beyond those stones are people whose names may already be gone. Children, parents, neighbors, friends, pioneers who endured frontier Florida just as surely as the families whose names we still recognize today. They're still here, even if history can no longer introduce us. One of the hardest parts about researching cemeteries like this is accepting that some questions may never have complete answers. Was this originally a private family cemetery? Or did it gradually become a community burial ground? Exactly how many people are buried here? How many wooden markers disappeared generations ago? How many names were simply lost before anyone thought to record them? The historical record doesn't always tell us. Genealogical records help. Family stories help. Local history helps. But every source has gaps. Instead of one perfect timeline, we're left with pieces. And sometimes those pieces are all history gives us. Oddly enough, I think that's what makes this place so fascinating, because it reminds us that history isn't always certain. Sometimes it's detective work. Sometimes it's listening carefully. Sometimes it's standing in a quiet place and realizing the land remembers more than the documents ever could. When Dusty and I first spotted this cemetery from the road, I thought we'd spend maybe 15 minutes here, take a few photographs, read a few headstones, then move on. Instead, we found ourselves coming back. Not because the cemetery is large, it's not. Not because it's famous, but because it still had stories left to tell. We discovered two pioneer families whose lives became deeply connected. We found traces of Florida's frontier. We met the county's first sheriff. And we uncovered a mystery that's probably still unfolding. But perhaps the most meaningful discovery wasn't hidden in an old record at all. It was realizing how fragile history can be. One fallen headstone. One unread inscription. One forgotten cemetery tucked back beneath the trees. That's all it takes for an entire chapter of someone's family story to begin disappearing. The truth is, we may never know every person buried here. We may never answer every question surrounding its origins. But that doesn't make this place any less important. If anything, it makes preserving it even more meaningful. Because sometimes the greatest act of remembrance isn't solving every mystery. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let the mystery disappear. If there's one thing this little cemetery reminded me of, it's that history isn't only found inside museums or behind glass cases. Sometimes it's hiding just beyond the edge of the road, waiting for someone to turn around. What about you? Have you ever stumbled across a forgotten cemetery, an abandoned homestead, or a place that made you wonder about the people who came before? I'd love to hear about it down in the comments. And if you enjoy uncovering the forgotten stories that shaped the places we visit today, be sure to subscribe. Because every week we're proving that some of the most remarkable history isn't the easiest history to find. Sometimes it's the history we almost drove right past. Thanks for joining me, and until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep history alive.